Welcome to the Risk Wheelhouse, the podcast where we navigate the ever-changing seas of risk management and technology. Join your hosts, Ori Wellington and Sam Jones, as they steer you through the latest trends, insights, and strategies shaping the future of integrated risk management. Ready to chart a course towards success? Hop aboard and let's set sail into today's deep dive.
93%. I mean, just think about that number for a second.
It's genuinely staggering when you actually unpack it.
Right. Welcome to this deep dive on the Risk Wheelhouse podcast, where we're looking at a completely mind-blowing disconnect today. Because in 9 out of 10 Fortune 500 companies right now, the department literally named Enterprise Risk Management is, well, they're entirely shut out of the company's strategic planning.
Yeah, they have absolutely no voice in how the enterprise strategically moves forward. They're completely blind to the future.
And we are diving deep into exactly why that is, addressing you, the listener who knows this space and is probably feeling this exact pain point. We're pulling from this incredibly dense stack of research today.
Primarily focusing on 2 interconnected articles published just this week by John A. Wheeler.
Right, in the RiskTech Journal, which is, of course, a free weekly publication by Wheelhouse Advisors. And Wheeler is bringing, 3 decades of executive risk advisory to this?
Yeah, 30 years. And he's looking at a problem that is, quite frankly, paralyzing boardrooms globally.
So our mission today is to uncover exactly why that 93% failure rate exists. And we want to decode a completely new way of mapping out organizational risk using a framework Wheeler calls the ERM Navigator Compass.
Because the premise we're exploring here is vital. You know, the failure of ERM isn't a human capital issue.
Right. It's not like the employees are just bad at their jobs.
Exactly. It isn't because of bad corporate culture or lazy employees. The reason risk management is failing to impact corporate strategy is due to an architectural flaw in how businesses are fundamentally built.
It's a structural failure, not a behavioral one. And to really understand that architectural flaw, I think we need to look at how this failure manifests in the real world, right?
Yeah.
Let's go straight into the boardroom.
Oh, the classic boardroom scenario. It plays out exactly the same way everywhere.
Totally. Imagine the typical quarterly review at any major global enterprise. The CEO is managing market volatility, supply chain disruptions, capital allocation, and they turn to their chief risk officer.
And they ask for guidance, right? They want the top 3 strategic risks threatening their current goals.
Yes. The CEO is essentially asking for navigation, where are the icebergs on our current route, and how does the CRO actually respond to that?
Well, they hand over a quarterly risk register refresh and a heat map.
A heat map, right. And if I'm a CEO trying to allocate capital dynamically across a really volatile global market, a static matrix of green, yellow, and red boxes doesn't help me at all.
No, it's practically useless for what they're asking.
I'm asking for forward-looking strategic velocity, and the CRO is handing me an inventory of known issues. It's like handing a ship's captain an inventory of life jackets when they are asking if there are icebergs on the current route.
That is a perfect analogy. It's a completely asymmetric exchange.
Yeah.
The CEO nods politely, thanks the CRO for the compliance update, and absolutely nothing about the company's strategic direction changes.
Nothing changes, which perfectly aligns with the stark numbers we see in the new practitioner guide released by COSO and Crowe.
Right, the guide titled From Guidance to Action, that's exactly where that 93% figure comes from.
93% of ERM programs are just not part of the strategy conversation. But the perception gap in that COSO data is what really highlights the internal friction for me.
Yeah, the gap between what risk leaders want to do and what they actually do.
Exactly. 98% of risk leaders believe ERM should play a strategic role, but only 7% report that it actually does.
So you have this entire profession that knows its mandate is supposed to be strategic, yet they are structurally locked out of doing it.
And when you look at how the rest of the business views them, the lockout becomes even more apparent, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. 54% of these programs are viewed strictly as a compliance or assurance function.
Oh.
Yeah, and only 28% are seen as a strategic partner.
So the business units are looking at the ERM team and basically saying, you are the assurance mechanism. You produce evidence for the audit committee. You don't help us capture market share.
Exactly. Which completely explains why the CEO ignores the heat map. I mean, a heat map is inherently retrospective.
Right. It categorizes a risk based on historical data and just freezes it in time.
It cannot show the velocity of a risk, and it certainly cannot map interconnected triggers across different business units.
The executive team is asking for a radar system, and ERM is handing them a photograph of where the ship used to be. But the industry obviously recognizes this disconnect, right? Like, the failure is universally acknowledged.
Oh, yeah. Everyone knows it's broken. But the real debate, and where John Wheeler's analysis sharply diverges from the CSO guide, is in the diagnosis of the underlying disease.
Let's unpack that divergence.
Yeah.
Because the authors of the COSO and Crowe guide look at that 93% failure rate, and they diagnose it as an implementation issue.
Right. They see it as a behavioral problem. Their interpretation is that the people in these roles just aren't, executing the mandate correctly.
So they prescribe behavioral fixes. They outline 10 operating disciplines for risk teams to adopt.
And they suggest establishing a minimum viable rhythm of about 5 hours a week, strictly dedicated to strategic risk conversations.
And they also strongly advocate for a cultural shift toward candor, right?
Yeah.
Pushing business leaders to speak more openly about emerging threats.
Exactly. Just be more honest and hold more meetings.
But wait, if I'm looking at a 93% systemic failure rate across the entire global corporate landscape, it seems incredibly naive to say, well, everyone just needs to schedule 5 more hours of meetings and be more honest.
Yeah, it really does.
That implies that 93% of global risk professionals are just lacking discipline, which defies statistical logic.
And that is precisely Wheeler's counterargument. He doesn't dismiss the value of operating discipline or candor. Good behavior is obviously always a net positive.
Sure.
But after 30 years of advising on these exact boardroom dynamics, he asserts that behavioral fixes will fundamentally fail to close this gap. You cannot fix a structural flaw with a behavioral patch.
Okay, so if the root cause isn't human behavior, what is the exact structural flaw? What is this massive architectural error that companies have built into their own org charts?
It's conflation. Organizations have fatally conflated ERM enterprise risk management with GRC governance, risk, and compliance.
They've just mashed them together.
Exactly. They have taken two distinctly different disciplines, merged them under a single umbrella, and expected them to perform simultaneously.
Let's really analyze what that conflation looks like mechanically inside a company, because this isn't just like a naming convention issue, is it?
Not at all. This conflation dictates reporting lines, technology procurement, capital allocation, everything.
Because in most enterprises, ERM and GRC report to the exact same leader.
They report to the same leader. They are forced to run on the exact same software platforms. They produce the exact same artifacts.
And they present those artifacts to the exact same primary audience, right? The corporate audit committee.
Exactly. The corporate audit committee is the audience for both.
But wait, if they share the same software architecture, the same leadership, and the same oversight committee, how can anyone realistically expect them to do two completely different jobs?
They can't. It's structurally impossible.
Because the software itself is going to enforce a specific workflow. If the platform is built to track compliance sign-offs, you can't just magically use it to model dynamic geopolitical scenarios.
You really can't. The structure dictates the output. And to understand why this conflation is so incredibly toxic to corporate strategy, we have to isolate the fundamental DNA of what GRC and ERM are actually built to achieve.
Let's do that. Let's look at their core objectives. What is the true mandate of governance, risk, and compliance? Like, what is GRC's actual job?
GRC's mandate is to bridge compliance and assurance. It exists to produce concrete evidence.
Evidence for who?
For auditors and regulators. Evidence that internal controls are operating, that regulatory policies are being strictly adhered to, and that employees are checking the necessary boxes.
Which means GRC is fundamentally wired for certainty. It operates in a binary pass-or-fail environment.
Completely binary. A control is either effective or it is deficient. A policy is either signed or it is ignored. Certainty is the ultimate currency of GRC.
And contrast that with the true mandate of ERM. ERM is not designed to bridge compliance and assurance.
No, ERM is designed to bridge assurance and performance.
Performance, that's the key word there.
Exactly. ERM's job is not to produce historical evidence of compliance. Its job is to produce decision-useful uncertainty signals.
Right. It exists to tell executives and capital allocators whether their strategic assumptions are holding up against external reality, and to identify the triggers that indicate a strategy actually needs to pivot.
So if GRC is wired for certainty, ERM requires the exact opposite. It requires exploring widening ranges of probability. It requires looking at weakening market assumptions.
You are trying to quantify the unknown, which, it's kind of like GRC is like grading a math test. There is a definitive right and wrong answer.
That's a great way to put it.
But true ERM is like forecasting the weather for a high-stakes outdoor event. It's about ranges of probability and preparedness.
Right, and that fundamental difference brings us to a really distorting statistic from the COSO survey that suddenly makes perfect sense in this context.
Oh, the psychological safety one?
Yes. Only 20% of respondents report having high psychological safety in leadership risk discussions.
That is wild. Only 20% feel safe talking about risk. But I guess that lack of psychological safety is a direct symptom of conflating certainty and uncertainty.
It absolutely is. Think about the psychological environment of GRC. GRC rewards a checked box and heavily punishes ambiguity.
Because to an auditor, ambiguity is a control failure.
Exactly. So if I'm a business unit leader and my risk department is structurally built as a GRC function, raising uncertainty is basically career suicide.
Because if I walk into a meeting and say, hey, the consumer data for our new product launch in Europe is getting volatile and our baseline assumptions might be 20% off, I am looking for a strategic discussion on capital reallocation.
But if you raise that in a conflated environment, which is what 93% of these companies are operating in the system, processes your strategic uncertainty as a compliance failure.
Oh, wow. So the response isn't, let's model some new scenarios.
No, the response is, you are out of compliance with your initial projections. This is a deficiency. Why haven't you remediated this?
That is terrifying. You are literally punished for raising a performance signal because the structure only knows how to process assurance data. No wonder no one feels safe talking about risks.
Right. And when business leaders push back, when they tell the risk team, you're just checking boxes, you're slowing us down, they're making a completely accurate diagnosis.
Because the risk team has been forced to bridge to the wrong objective.
Exactly. Which brings us to the visual framework John Wheeler uses to dismantle this conflation. He maps this out using the ERM navigator compass.
And to visualize this, you really have to picture the 4 cardinal directions, right? Each anchoring a specific domain of risk. Let's map the compass for the listener.
Okay, let's start at the west anchor.
What's sitting on the west anchor?
The west anchor is GRC. Governance, risk, and compliance. And this anchor is fundamentally tied to organizational policies. It is a defensive perimeter.
Got it. Policies and defense. Then we move down to the south anchor.
The south anchor is TRM, Technology Risk Management. This is tied to your assets.
Meaning your digital infrastructure, your physical hardware, your data security, all of that.
Exactly. So west is policies, south is assets.
Over on the east anchor, we have what?
The east anchor is ORM, Operational Risk Management. This domain is tied to processes.
So the actual day-to-day friction of running the business.
Right. Supply chains, health and safety protocols, business continuity, third-party vendor management, that all lives in the east.
Which leaves the north anchor. What is pointing north?
The north anchor is ERM, Enterprise Risk Management, and it is tied entirely to goals.
Goals. So it points toward the strategic horizon, focusing on performance, market share, and capital allocation.
Precisely. And this compass model completely clarifies the architectural flaw we've been talking about.
Because if we look at what happens when a company conflates ERM with GRC, when they put them under the same leader in the same audit committee reporting line, they are effectively taking the ERM function and dragging it off the north anchor.
Yes, they drag it all the way over to the west. Wheeler calls this the severed bridge.
The severed bridge.
When ERM is forced into the west anchor, the north anchor completely empties out. The bridge between assurance and performance is destroyed. The company is flying blind strategically.
So to paint a picture for you listening, it's like you have an entire organization crowded on the west side of the ship, meticulously verifying that the compliance lifeboats are secured, while absolutely no one is standing at the bow looking north to see where the ship is actually sailing.
That's exactly it. And this is why Wheeler makes a very crucial distinction here. He says that the 54% of programs that the business views as mere compliance functions aren't actually failing.
Wait, they aren't failing?
They aren't failing at their assigned structure. They are successfully executing GRC because that is how they are structurally built and incentivized.
Oh, I see. If you build a machine to optimize for certainty and compliance, you cannot fault the machine when it produces heat maps and audit reports instead of dynamic strategic forecasting.
Exactly. Separating ERM from GRC doesn't mean diminishing GRC. GRC on the west anchor is absolutely vital for keeping the enterprise legally viable.
But separating them is the only way to allow the north anchor to actually function.
Right.
So if an enterprise leadership team is listening to this right now and they realize their north anchor is completely empty, what does structurally repositioning ERM actually entail? Like, what does a properly functioning north anchor look like in practice?
Well, the first fundamental change is the data feeds. An ERM function on the West Anchor relies on internal audit reports and compliance attestations.
Backward-looking data.
Exactly. But a north-anchored ERM relies on operational telemetry, financial systems data, and external market indicators. It ingests data to stress test strategic assumptions.
And the cadence has to change as well, right? You
Yeah.
can't run a north anchor on a quarterly refresh cycle.
No, the timing completely shifts. The reporting cadence of a north-anchored ERM aligns with the heartbeat of the business itself.
So it aligns with like capital allocation gates, M&A evaluations, and major product delivery checkpoints.
Exactly. And the outputs graduate from static to dynamic. You basically throw the heat map in the trash.
Good riddance to the heat map. So what replaces it?
You replace it with scenario ranges, leading indicators, and specific trigger thresholds that alert executives when a strategic assumption is deteriorating.
And most importantly, the primary audience changes, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You no longer report primarily to the audit committee. You report to the executive team and the strategy committee of the board.
Now, this theoretical framework makes total logical sense, but Wheeler doesn't stop at theory. To prove how pervasive this conflation is, we have to look at the second article in our source material.
Right, which analyzes real-world evidence from a recent, highly prestigious gathering of risk practitioners.
Yes, the 2026 ERM Roundtable Summit at NC State's Poole College. This summit gathered over 110 top-tier risk professionals.
And we should clarify, this is not a group of novices. These are the people defining the industry standard for Fortune 500 companies.
Absolutely.
Are you ready to see risk management in action? At Wheelhouse Advisors, we've launched a new YouTube channel dedicated to integrated risk management. You'll find quick explainers, insights from our IRM Navigator research reports, highlights from the Risk Journal, and conversations from the Risk Wheelhouse podcast. We're covering the topics that matter most to executives and risk leaders, from AI governance and cyber insurance to operational resilience and regulatory change. Every video is designed to help you anticipate risks, adapt with confidence, and build resilience in a digital-first world. In our first video, we explain how ISO 42001, the EU AI Act, and the NIST AI Risk Management Framework can work together as a unified playbook for AI risk. Subscribe today at youtube.com/@wheelhouseadv and get the latest insights delivered directly to you. That's youtube.com/@wheelhouseadv. Subscribe now and stay ahead of the risks that matter most.
And at this summit, two major case studies were presented that perfectly illustrate the trap of the West Anchor. We have presentations from Christy Absher of ExxonMobil and Chelsea Jaworski-Smith of Westinghouse.
On paper, their programs sound like the absolute pinnacle of corporate risk management. They are massive, highly mature, incredibly impressive achievements.
Let's look at ExxonMobil first. Christy Absher detailed a program based on aligned assurance.
Right. This was a monumental structural effort to connect compliance, internal audit, legal and operational risk into a unified taxonomy.
Giving leadership shared visibility across all traditional lines of defense. To achieve that at the scale of ExxonMobil requires immense capital, political capital, and technological integration. It is a massive undertaking.
It really is. And then you have Westinghouse.
Right. Chelsea Jaworski-Smith described a program at Westinghouse that was deeply embedded into strategic planning, largely sustained through intense relationship-driven networks across business functions.
Allowing the risk team to navigate years of organizational upheaval. These programs are celebrated as the gold standard of ERM.
But Wheeler delivers a brutally provocative diagnosis of these case studies. He looks at ExxonMobil and Westinghouse and says, these are phenomenal programs, but they are absolutely not GRM.
Yeah, he says they are perfect examples of successful GRC at the coordinated stage.
But wait, If I'm the CEO of ExxonMobil and I'm spending tens of millions of dollars integrating my audit and legal teams, if my team stands up at an ERM summit and calls it ERM, isn't it a bit bold for an advisor to reclassify it as just GRC?
It sounds incredibly bold, maybe even arrogant, until you apply the structural definitions of the compass.
Right. Try telling my shareholders that aligned assurance isn't a strategic risk function.
Well, to understand his diagnosis, we have to introduce the evolutionary component of Wheeler's framework, the ERM navigator curve.
So if the compass maps the positions of risk, the curve maps the evolution of risk maturity over time.
Exactly. It maps out how an organization actually evolves its risk capability.
Okay, let's dissect this curve for the listener. How does it work?
The curve tracks the journey from a state of complete risk dysfunction to a state of complete risk agency across 5 specific stages.
What are those 5 stages?
They are foundational, coordinated, embedded, extended, and autonomous.
Foundational, coordinated, embedded, extended, autonomous.
Okay, where do ExxonMobil and Westinghouse sit on this evolutionary timeline?
They have successfully mastered the transition from the foundational stage to the coordinated stage.
Let's define what that means. What is the foundational stage?
The foundational stage is just getting your house in order. It's basic ad hoc compliance, ensuring policies are written, checking the mandatory legal boxes.
It's the bare minimum required to not get shut down by regulators.
Exactly. Moving from foundational to coordinated requires massive investment, but it is fundamentally a GRC investment because the coordinated stage is about standardizing reporting, right?
Yes. Creating a shared taxonomy and forcing audit, legal, and compliance to talk to each other so the board gets a unified picture of assurance.
Which is exactly what ExxonMobil's aligned assurance is. It is the absolute peak of coordinating the West Anchor.
Right, but Wheeler's point is that if you define ERM simply as integrating your lines of defense, all you are doing is pouring concrete around your GRC function and labeling it strategy.
You've built a beautiful, coordinated compliance machine. But the North Anchor, the bridge to performance, the forecasting of strategic uncertainty remains completely unbuilt.
Exactly. So mastering the coordinated stage is a trap if you think it's the finish line. It just makes you the best in the world at backward-looking assurance.
Okay, so if coordinated isn't the end goal, how does an enterprise actually break out of the West Anchor? What defines the transition to the next stage, the embedded stage?
To reach the embedded stage, the conversation has to shift away from assurance entirely. Embedded risk means the risk function is no longer a separate oversight department asking business units for quarterly reports.
It has to be baked in.
Yes. It means risk mechanics are woven directly into the daily operational processes of the business, sustained by real-time monitoring rather than periodic audits.
Which brings us back to the compass. If West is GRC and North is ERM, embedded risk is the activation of the East Anchor, right?
Yes, the East Anchor, ORM, or Operational Risk Management.
Because ORM encompasses the massive, complex realities of daily execution. It covers ESG and sustainability, environmental health and safety, supplier and third-party risk, and business continuity.
It is exactly where strategy meets the friction of reality.
And we actually have a prime example of an organization attempting this embedded stage execution from the summit sources.
We do, during the Westinghouse presentation.
Right. They detailed their response to the COVID-19 pandemic. They executed an 18-month cross-functional assessment that engaged 8 different work streams.
They were diving deep into supply chain resilience, workforce availability, and infrastructure stability.
That is a textbook definition of operational risk management operating at an intense, embedded stage level.
It really is. You are mapping out how a localized shock to a Tier 2 supplier in Asia impacts workforce deployment in Europe. It requires deep process integration.
But there was a glaring vulnerability in how Westinghouse sustained this, which Wheeler highlights.
A huge vulnerability.
Chelsea Jaworski-Smith explicitly stated that her ability to execute this level of integration relied heavily on her strong personal relationships across the enterprise.
Yeah, she noted that without those relationships, she wouldn't have been invited to the strategic planning tables.
And this is where we have to dissect a very dangerous corporate myth, because we are constantly told that business is all about relationships, right? That breaking down silos requires networking and personal capital.
We hear it all the time.
Nah.
But Wheeler points out that relying on personal relationships to execute enterprise risk is a fatal structural vulnerability.
But why? Like, if relationships are the glue of a successful corporate culture, why is it a liability for the risk team to rely on them?
Because true embedded risk must survive the individual. Think about the mechanical fragility of a relationship-driven program.
Okay, fragile how?
What happens if Chelsea Jaworski-Smith gets poached by a competitor? What happens if Westinghouse acquires a massive new subsidiary where she has zero established relationships?
Oh, I see. Or what happens during unprecedented zero-day crisis where there is literally no time to call in favors and schedule alignment meeting?
Exactly. The entire risk apparatus collapses.
So if your risk program only functions because the business leaders happen to like and trust the risk officer enough to invite them to the meeting,
Yeah.
you do not actually have an embedded risk program.
No, you just have a highly charismatic individual doing heroic ad hoc work.
Risk is in the process, not in the relationship. That concept is so powerful.
It's essential. True embedded maturity means the risk triggers, the data telemetry, and the reporting mandates are hard-coded into the operational workflows.
The system has to detect the failing supply chain regardless of who is sitting in the CRO's chair.
Precisely. And this transition from relationship-driven risk to process-driven, hard-coded risk is no longer just an academic debate about best practices.
No, it has become an immediate existential necessity due to the terrifying velocity of emerging threats, which transitions us into the most urgent application of this entire framework.
Yes. Why this structural shift has to happen today, not next quarter.
Because at the end of the Pool Summit, the organizers ran a round-robin discussion to uncover the raw, unfiltered pressures keeping these top practitioners awake at night.
And the consensus was immediate. The top shared pressures across the board were AI and data governance, coupled with massive geopolitical uncertainty.
Let's plot those threats on the ERM navigator curve. We've discussed foundational, coordinated, and embedded. Where do AI and geopolitics sit?
They sit squarely in the extended and autonomous stages of the curve. These are highly interconnected, hyperspeed operational risks that exist far beyond the traditional four walls of the enterprise.
Let's zero in on AI governance, because this perfectly illustrates the failure of the conflated West Anchor. We aren't just talking about employees using a chatbot to write marketing copy here.
Oh no, we are talking about the deployment of agentic AI.
Agentic AI, meaning artificial intelligence systems granted agency to execute tasks autonomously across enterprise workflows to achieve predefined goals.
Right. You are looking at AI systems dynamically rerouting global shipping logistics based on real-time weather satellite data.
Or autonomous pricing algorithms adjusting costs across millions of SKUs in milliseconds based on competitive micromovements.
They are making operational decisions at literal machine speed 24 hours a day.
Now imagine a traditional West Anchor GRC program trying to govern an agentic AI system. The CRO walks in with their quarterly risk register refresh and a heat map.
It is completely absurd. It is structurally impossible to govern a system executing 10,000 decisions a minute using a quarterly compliance cadence.
It's a total mismatch of velocity. Trying to manage agentic AI with a quarterly heat map is like trying to photograph a speeding bullet with a Polaroid camera. By the time the picture develops, the damage is already done.
Exactly. If an organization treats AI governance like a traditional GRC exercise, meaning they just verify that an AI ethics policy was signed by the engineering team and check a box, they are governing the ghost of yesterday's risk.
Meanwhile, tomorrow's risk is actively executing code, reallocating capital, and altering supply chains in their live environment.
The traditional tools of certainty and compliance shatter under the pressure of machine speed uncertainty.
You cannot check a box to govern an autonomous algorithm. You have to embed real-time telemetry directly into the AI's operational domain. You need cross-domain analytics to monitor the triggers.
Which is why Wheeler noted something very telling about the summit itself. The fact that AI governance surfaced organically during a round-robin discussion rather than being the structured keynote of the conference is a massive signal.
What does that signal tell us?
It indicates that enterprises are treating AI as a peripheral challenge, something they hope they can manage at the coordinated stage by just drafting a new policy.
But the moment they realize their static, relationship-driven infrastructure cannot keep pace with algorithmic velocity, the structural cracks turn into fault lines.
Exactly. So how does an enterprise actually fix this? As we pull these threads together, we have to synthesize the behavioral prescriptions of the COSO guide with the structural imperatives of Wheeler's compass.
Because Wheeler isn't telling companies to throw the COSO guide away, is he?
Not at all. The COSO guide's 10 disciplines, the focus on cadence, the culture of candor, those are the correct behaviors.
But behaviors are fundamentally like software. If you install brilliant software on the wrong hardware architecture, it will crash.
Precisely. You must apply those behaviors inside the correct positional frame.
So the ultimate path forward is a sequential structural realignment. Step 1, stop the conflation. Separate ERM from GRC.
Yes. Leave GRC firmly on the west anchor. Resource it properly to do its vital job of bridging compliance and assurance. Let it produce certainty for the regulators.
Then consciously build a distinct ERM function on the north anchor, entirely focused on bridging assurance and performance.
And step 2 is guiding the evolutionary investment along the IRM curve. Once you have built your foundational and coordinated GRC, you have to stop buying more GRC and calling it strategy.
You must shift your investment horizontally into the east anchor.
You move to the embedded stage by investing in operational risk management. You hard-code risk telemetry into your processes so it survives the departure of key personnel.
And from there, you build toward the extended and autonomous stages to handle third-party networks and AI velocity. It is a deliberate, stage-by-stage journey.
And when an organization actually completes this structural realignment, when they empower a true north-anchored ERM, they finally unlock what the CEO in our boardroom example was begging for in the first place.
Right. Dynamic, forward-looking, decision-useful signals about the strategic performance of the enterprise.
You finally give leadership a radar system instead of an inventory of life jackets.
For those of you listening who recognize your own organization in these 93% failure statistics and want to explore the mechanics of this transition further, these frameworks are incredibly accessible.
Yes, the IRM Navigator Compass, the IRM Navigator Curve, and this level of deep positional analysis are central to John A. Wheeler's ongoing work at Wheelhouse Advisors.
You can follow this evolving methodology in their free publication, the RiskTech Journal, which provided our source material today.
And for enterprises actively looking to execute this structural shift, Wheelhouse provides a premium research platform called the RTJ Bridge.
Right. It connects this topical coverage directly to actionable, exhaustive research notes within their IRM Navigator report series. You can find all of this, including episodes of the Risk Wheelhouse podcast, at wheelhouseadvisors.com.
It is the literal blueprint for moving an enterprise from risk dysfunction to risk agency. It provides the architectural schematics to rebuild that severed bridge.
We have covered immense ground today. We started in a frustrating, stagnant boardroom. We diagnosed the fatal conflation of ERM and GRC,
contrasting the pass-fail psychology of certainty against the dynamic necessity of uncertainty.
We mapped out the 4 anchors of the IRM compass, redefined the coordinated achievements of ExxonMobil and Westinghouse, and stared down the machine speed velocity of agentic AI.
And the connective tissue through all of it is that structure dictates output. If you want strategic foresight, you have to build an architecture capable of producing it.
You absolutely do. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We spent this time breaking down how the conflation of risk and compliance destroys strategic visibility.
But think about the opportunity cost of that blindness over time.
The compounding effect, right. If our global corporate structures have spent the last 3 decades systematically confusing backward-looking certainty with forward-looking performance,
it really makes you wonder.
It does. How much incredible, world-changing innovation has your organization missed out on, not because the ideas were bad, but simply because the people in charge of analyzing risk were structurally forbidden from looking at the future? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Go take a hard look at your organization's compass, find out where your anchors are dropped, and we will see you next time.
That wraps up another episode of the Risk Wheelhouse. Thank you for spending time with us at Wheelhouse Advisors today. We hope you found the conversation insightful and actionable for your organization's risk strategies. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. If you're looking for more in-depth analysis and thought leadership on risk technology, be sure to visit the RiskTech Journal at theriskTechJournal.com. It's your go-to source for comprehensive articles, expert interviews, and the latest trends shaping the industry. Subscribe today to stay informed. For any inquiries or feedback, please contact us directly at info@wheelhouseadvisors.com, or feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn and x.com and share your thoughts or suggestions for future topics. Visit wheelhouseadvisors.com for more information and resources. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, navigate wisely.